You are looking at a Canadian geezer with a mug of rich brown steaming tea who began collecting comics over 60 years ago. And I want to share with you what I've found out about Canadian Golden Age comics. I remember buying FF1 and AF15 off the stands. But back then, when you're 10, 12 years old, it wasn't a big deal. They were there among the Archies, the Dells, the Charltons, ACGs, Harveys, and all those familiar DC titles. But they were nothing special. They just looked a little bit different from the other comics. But they were worth checking out. We had no idea the Marvel Empire that was to come in 50 years. No idea about that and Marvel movies or the changes that the comic collecting world was going to go through. Anyway, I got away from collecting in the late 70s as life grew around me, and I became an educator and eventually retired in 2012. At that point, I needed to find a passion to float me through those balmy years out to pasture, and so I turned back to comics. And I remembered that Canada had its own comics during the Second World War, and nobody really knew much about them. There were a bunch of books that I remember that introduced me to Canadian comics, among them The Great Comic Book Heroes, put out in 1971. The authors were Patrick Lebert, Michael Hirsch, and Clive Smith, who designed the book and produced all the art. And this book gave rise to Nelvana Studios during the 80s and 90s, and the biggest independent animation studio in the world at the time. But they concentrated only on one company, and that was Bell Features. The other books that I remember were John Bell's Canuck Comics, put out by Mark Scheinblum's Matrix Press back in 1986. And this has an article by my friend Bob McMillan on Anglo-American comics in it. It has a great Kent Stacy cover depicting a lot of the heroes from that time. And actually has an introduction by Harlan Ellison, who was a big Canadian comic book fan growing up in Cleveland. The other book by John Bell, put out in 2006, about 20 years after the first one, was Invaders of the North. And that gives you a good account of what was happening in Canadian comics in an overall view sort of sense. Well, I had found my target, these old Canadian comics, and I started researching them. And subsequently, I began to blog on these old Canadian comics on Comic Book Daily. I became an Overstreet advisor on them. I gave talks in cons, libraries, and galleries about them. And I came up with a book on the artists from these old comics. Eventually, that was in 2018. And it was called Heroes of the Homefront. It's a 300-page book with original art pages scanned from the Library and Archives in Canada. And it was on Bell Features artists. This is out of print now, but there's a second edition coming out in the new year. And accompanying that second edition will be a companion volume on the 800 or so comic book covers that were on those Canadian wartime comics. So I look forward to putting that out as well. And this will be coming out through Raid Studios in Toronto. The other book that I put out was the WECA Comic Book Price Guide, with another great Kent Stacy cover, this time of Speed Savage's alter ego, The White Mask. This needs to be re-edited and brought up to date. And I don't know when I'll get around to doing that. But this is out of print as well. So I began researching these comics. I met a bunch of the artists. Well, not a bunch. There were only about 3 of them who were still alive at the time. And talked to them and did interviews with them. So given all that, what I want to do here is to share a bunch of the things I found out in doing my research on these first Canadian comics, so that we might remove that whole cloud of misinformation and general ignorance that surrounds them. So let's get down to it. This won't be a talk about grading decimal points, whether it's a 9.6 or 9.8, about any unboxings, about finds in the wild, about showing off trophy books, It won't be about commodification of these old Canadian comic books in any way. I just wanted to share with you what's in them and get you interested in them. And I want to let more people know, and especially my fellow Canadians, about our early Canadian comics in order to give them, the comics, the collecting respect that they deserve. So there were two main periods to Canadian comics from the Golden Age. The first was from 1941 to 46, and the follow-up was from about 1948 to roughly the time of the Comics Code in the States. Now, how did Canada get its first Canadian comics? Well, we did have all the American comics on our newsstands from the mid-30s on, and we could buy Action 1 and Superman 1 and Detective 27. But Canada, when we entered World War II just a couple of days after England did in early September of 1939, it changed our world. And after being in the war for over a year, remember, the States didn't come into the war until December of 1941. So after being in the war for over a year, Canada found its economy and dollar sagging badly. So on December 6, 1940, that's about, a year and a few months after the start of the war, Canada enacted a law that would stop the importation of products from the States that it deemed unessential to the war effort. These are products such as candy, certain magazines, toiletries, pulps, and comic books. The name of this Act of Parliament was the War Exchange Conservation Act. And this produces the acronym WECA, which I used to serve as a descriptive term for these first Canadian comics. And these comics started appearing in our country in 1941. You're probably familiar with the acronym SOTI, S-O-T-I, to describe the books that appeared in Wortham's book on the evils of comic books. And GGA to stand for Good Girl Art Comic Books. Well, I use WECA, W-E-C-A, in much the same way. I prefer this term for these first Canadian comics rather than the more casual term, because the term Canadian whites doesn't really describe anything much at all. It doesn't give a time period to them. It doesn't limit what issues were there. And not all of these comics were in just black and white. 15% of the comics produced in Canada during that first period, 1941 to 46, were in color. And in today's social-cultural orientation, you can imagine standing in a supermarket checkout line and saying, I love Canadian whites, and watching the heads whip around. So that, to me, is just too casual a term for these comics. It doesn't say much about them at all. The term WECA comics delimits them and focuses on what they really were. Anyway, when 1941 dawned, there were no new American comics on the newsstands. We never got a Cap American 1, for example. But a few printers who saw this coming, saw this act that was going to stop American comics, were ready to fill the vacuum. And the first issue of Better Comics, #1, was published in Vancouver by Maple Leaf Publications and appeared on the stands on February 1st, even though the cover date was March 1941. Around the same time, the first issue of Robin Hood Comics was published in Toronto by Anglo-American Comics. Though these came out at the same time, Better Comics #1 is regarded as the first Canadian comic book because it actually looked like a regular floppy comic book. While Robin Hood #1 was a tabloid-sized comic, sort of like a Sunday comics page on newsprint that folded down into a compact comic book size to appear on the stands with the other comic books, but it had no separate cover. So after these two comic books, 6 months later, in September 1941, a new Toronto publisher called Commercial Signs of Canada put out Wow Comics #1. This was a full-color comic from cover to cover. And this company, shortly in 1942, came to be called Bell Features. The last of the four major Canadian wartime publishers to come on board was Educational Projects out of Montreal, and they produced the first issue of its main title, Canadian Heroes Comics, cover dated October 1942. So there you have four publishers: Vancouver's Maple Leaf Publications, Toronto's Anglo-American, and Bell Features, and then Educational Projects in Montreal. What was important about these comics that came out from 1941 to 46 was that they were produced entirely by Canadian creators. They were set in Canadian locales and they featured Canadian heroes fighting the enemies of our country. And they connected kids across Canada by forming clubs, pen pal clubs, telling them how they could raise funds for war steps and support the war. But when the war ended in May of 1945, the War Exchange Conservation Act was gradually repealed and American comics poured over the border. The original Canadian comics survived for about 18 more months. But by the end of 1946, the last of them disappeared off our shelves. So this is the first age of Canadian comics, 1941 to 46. This first period of comics, of Canadian comics, if we look at some examples. So here is a Lucky Comics edition from 1945. It's well produced. Good John Stables cover. The interior is black and white. And a good example of what a Canadian comic was from this very first period, all original stories. Here is an example of an Anglo-American comic. Now, these are known for having newsprint covers and generally are found in worse shape. But they made a deal with Fawcett. You can see all these Fawcett characters on the cover of the Spy Smasher comic. And this was a Toronto company. This is a later issue from around 1945 of Freelance Robin Hood comics, full color, cover, glossy cover, and inside pages that were in full color as well. Here is a Bell Features comic, Joe Comics 21. Again, well produced. Interiors are black and white. And the comics that the Bell Features comics had print runs of around 50,000, so were well distributed across the country. Lastly came the Montreal comics, and here's an example of Canadian heroes from educational projects. This was more like the American issues of True Comics or Real Heroes, factual, historic, informative, and supposed to edify our kids. Those were the four main publishers. 1947 was mostly just American comics on our stands. But toward the end of 1947, history began to repeat itself, and Canada found its economy and dollar floundering again. So the government jumped into action and banned American comics from coming into Canada a second time. But this time, it allowed American comics to be reprinted here in Canada, which it didn't allow that first time from 1941 to 46. This Act of Parliament was put into effect on November 17th, 1947, and one of its names was the Foreign Exchange Conservation Act, with just an F instead of the W for WECA, so we can call it FECA, F-E-C-A. We call those comics from the first age of Canadian comics WECA, or wartime comics, and these comics from this new reprint period, we call that the FECA period, or reprint period, in Canadian comics. With the government allowing reprints this time, American publishers would send their mats up to be reprinted here in Canada, and this left little incentive to produce Canadian comics at the time. The kind of comics that came out in this second period of Canadian comics were three kinds. First of all, there were direct reprints, where the covers of the Canadian editions would look like the American originals, and there might be some indication that on the cover that this was a Canadian printing. It might be a distributor's initials such as CDL or SSD. The indicia would say that the comic was printed in Canada. These reprints looked like the originals, but there were only 36 pages compared to the American originals, which were usually 48. So that one full story would be dropped from the Canadian edition. On top of this, some reprints had American ads removed, so that the inside covers were blank, or they had the American ads converted to Canadian ads. Canadian reprints were also notorious for bad color register on the inside. And this is another way of defining a reprint. And from the reprint period, here's an example of an Archie comic. Looks exactly sort of like an American comic, just with Canadian ads. And it's hard to tell how different it was. It was just smaller, had fewer pages, and the story left out. Here is Astonishing, put out by Bell Features. This does say Canadian edition on it. There's a little CDL below that A in Astonishing, shows you it's a Canadian distributor, but very much like the American comic in every other way, except in size. Adventure Comics from DC. Again, this has printed in Canada on it, so you can see the difference. But again, it's smaller in size. So this, again, is that first type where it looks like a reprint. And the last one I'll show you is Black Cat Comics. Again, they look very much like the American comics, but with one story missing. And these are the reprints. That's the first category, the outright reprints. The second category from the reprint period were a few original content Canadian comics, such as Captain Hobby comics, Science comics, and Hockey comics, which were put out by export publications. Also in this category of original Canadian comics in the reprint period, you have to put the superior horror comics, such as Haunt of Fear, Journey into Fear. The content of these were new original stories and original art pages from American studios that were shipped to Toronto and printed here for distribution in Canada and the US. Here's an example of the superior reprints. These aren't the horror comics, but reprints from about 1947, 48, 49. And you can see that little maple leaf in the circle, which says Superior Publications in the top right-hand corner. And here's an example of Science comics from export publications, which contained all new material and was distributed in the States as well. Now, besides these outright reprints and some of the new original stuff that came out during 1947 to 53 or so, there was a third category, which consisted of what I call hybrid comics. These were different from the regular American reprints because the covers were completely new and had never appeared in the US. Now, what the Canadian publishers did to make covers for these distinctive American reprints was to take a splash page image, usually from one of those stories inside, but sometimes from another book altogether, and make that the central image of this new cover. So you had American reprints on the inside, but the cover was a new cover that had never been seen before. And what they did in addition to this was they put a completely new made-up title, and they quite often didn't begin the run at number one. So these comics had new covers that had not appeared anywhere before. For me, these are the most fun of the Canadian reprint era comics to collect. Let me show you some of them. Here is an issue of Superb Comics. I believe it was Buccaneers. Buccaneers number 3. Taken off and put on a new color background with a new title. And the number is number 44, and you see that CDL, distributor's number, there. Here is Active Comics, and this is strange because it uses the banner Active Comics that was used during the very first age. There were 29 issues of Active Comics that came out, and now they jumped to number 97. The CDL is there, and you've got Plastic Man on the cover. Cover that never appeared in the States. Another hybrid, Asia Comics, number 16, with Rula on the cover. Splash panel used for a cover. Zoot Comics, number 13, Blue Beetle. Splash panel used for the cover. Funny title here, Crack Adventures, with JoJo splash for the cover, number 22. And super duper, number 192 with Namora on the cover, splash page, or a cover, I can't remember. But comic with this title never appeared anywhere else before. It's something new. These are what I call hybrids. So there you have it. Two eras of the Canadian Golden Age. The first, a set of almost 800 mostly original comics that existed from 1941 to 46. And the second, an unknown number of mostly reprinted American comics, some with new covers. And this existed from 1947 till about 1953. So you've got the basic picture of what the Canadian Golden Age was like. In the next video, I'd like to review the sales of the top books, the top 10 books in each one of these categories, and deal with any of the question or comments you might make on this video. If you found this video interesting and you'd like to find out more about Canadian comics before the Comics Code, subscribe and make comments and we'll help you out with them. Looking forward to letting you know about our great old Canadian comics. This is Ivan Kochmara.